Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that there is no airport anywhere near your home. No commercial flights, no highway, no train. And if you want to leave, you have to get on a boat and cross hundreds of kilometers of open Pacific Ocean. Now imagine that you're not living on some giant island. You're living on a tiny ring of coral, surrounded by an enormous lagoon, where only a few hundred people call the place home. And here's the strange part. People don't just visit this place. They actually live here. They go to work. Children go to school. People go fishing. Families go to church. Supplies arrive. Boats come and go. Life continues, almost as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. This is Nukunonu, one of the 3 tiny atolls that make up Tokelau. And if you've never heard of Tokelau before, you're definitely not alone, because this is one of those places that seems to exist almost outside the normal map of the world. But once you start asking one simple question, how do people actually live here? Things get very interesting, because getting to Nukunonu is only the beginning. The real story is what happens after you arrive. To understand Nukunu, first forget what you normally think of as an island. This isn't a place where you land at an airport, grab a taxi, and check into a hotel. Tokelau doesn't have an airport. The journey begins in Apia, Samoa. And from there, the only practical way to continue is by sea. The voyage can take roughly a full day or more, depending on the destination and conditions. Think about that for a moment. A normal vacation might begin with, where's the nearest airport? Here. There isn't one. Your journey begins with the ocean. And the ocean isn't simply scenery here. It is the road. It is the highway. It is the supply route. It is the connection between communities. And sometimes, it is the thing that separates them from everything else. Tokelau is made up of 3 atolls, Atoll, Nukunonu, and Fakafo. They're separated by open ocean, and together they contain only a tiny amount of land. The highest points are only a few meters above sea level. So before we've even reached Nukunu, there's already a strange question hanging over this place. How do you build a functioning society on something this small? And this is where Nukunonu gets even stranger. Because technically, Nukunonu isn't just one island. It's an atoll. Picture a giant ring. Now imagine that the ring is made from dozens of tiny pieces of land, with a massive body of water trapped in the middle. That's Nukunonu. Around 30 islets form a thin green ring around a huge lagoon. The land area is only around 5 square kilometers, while the lagoon covers roughly 100 square kilometers. So from above, Nukunonu doesn't look like a conventional island. It looks like a thin necklace, floating in an ocean that seems almost impossibly large. And this is where the first misconception disappears. Because when you hear a tiny island with a few hundred people, you might imagine a small patch of land with houses scattered everywhere. That's not really what Nukunonu is. Most of the human activity is concentrated into a very small part of this enormous atoll. The community's main settlements are around Fale and Motuhaga, connected by a concrete bridge. And once you see the geography, you begin to understand something. There simply isn't much room to waste. Every road, every house, every boat, every piece of imported material has a reason for being there. Now here's something we rarely think about when watching videos about remote islands. We see the beautiful water, the palm trees, the little houses, and it looks like paradise. But people don't live on scenery. They need food. They need fuel, medicine, building materials, school supplies, machinery, and all the other things modern life quietly depends on. So if there is no airport and no road connecting Nukunonu to another country, how does everything get here? The answer is ships. Shipping is the essential transportation link for Tokelau. There are no airstrips. There are no conventional roads connecting the atolls to the outside world. Access is by sea, and that creates a very different relationship with time. On the mainland, if a supermarket runs out of something, another delivery truck might arrive tomorrow. Here, the ocean controls the schedule, and historically, getting cargo ashore could be a complicated process in itself. Larger ships can't simply pull up like a ferry at a major port. Cargo may have to be transferred into smaller boats before reaching the community. In other words, even the simple act of getting something onto the island can become an operation. And this is where I want you to forget the image of Nukunonu as some abandoned tropical paradise. Because it isn't. There is a community here. A real one. There are homes. There is a school. There is medical infrastructure. There are administrative buildings. There are roads. There are churches. And there are people with jobs, responsibilities, families, and routines. Each atoll has its own administrative center, school, and essential services. And that tells us something important. Nukunonu isn't surviving by accident. It has systems. But those systems operate on a very different scale. Imagine a place where almost everybody knows everybody else. Where a community event isn't something you advertise to thousands of strangers. Because almost everyone already knows what's happening. Where a boat arriving isn't just transportation. It can mean supplies have arrived. And where fishing isn't merely a hobby. Because the ocean is one of the community's most important resources. One of the most fascinating things about Nukunonu is how closely everyday life remains connected to the lagoon and ocean. Fishing has traditionally been central to life in Tokelau. But there's another idea that's particularly interesting. It's called Inati. The basic principle is communal sharing. When a major fishing event takes place, the catch isn't simply divided up among whoever happened to be on the boat. The fish can be brought back and distributed through the community. A fishing expedition can involve many people, each with a different role. Some go out on the water. Others prepare equipment. Others handle the catch. And eventually, the food comes back to the community. That means the ocean isn't just providing food. It becomes part of the social structure. Fishing connects families. It connects generations. And it reinforces the idea that survival isn't necessarily an individual activity. It's communal. And that becomes increasingly important when you're living on a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Because if something goes wrong, there aren't thousands of people nearby to help. Your community is the first line of support. And even here, technology is changing things. Traditional dugout canoes once played a major role in fishing. Today, aluminium boats are increasingly common. But some traditional practices haven't disappeared. New Zealand Geographic has documented one of the last traditional wakaeame on Nukunonu, where the tradition of using the canoe was still being kept alive. And this is one of the recurring themes of Nukunu. Modern life is here, but it hasn't completely replaced the old way of doing things. You can have aluminium boats, solar technology, modern houses, and smartphones, while traditional fishing knowledge still matters. It's not really a choice between old world or modern world. It's both. And that combination is what makes places like Nukunonu so fascinating. Now imagine actually walking through the settlement. There is no giant city skyline, no traffic jam, no endless rows of apartment blocks. The community is compact. The roads are simple. The houses are close to one another. And because the land is so limited, the entire settlement feels connected to the lagoon. The village is structured around several main roads, including routes running alongside the lagoon and ocean. So you can almost think of Nukunonu as having three directions: toward the lagoon, through the village, and toward the open ocean. And whichever direction you walk, you're never very far from water. That's one of the things that makes living here fundamentally different. On the mainland, water is often something you travel toward. Here, water surrounds you. And then there's another part of Nukunonu that reveals something about the community. The church. Sunday Mass is an important communal event. Households turn out for the service. And that might sound ordinary. But in a place this small, community events have a different weight. If hundreds of people live in one compact settlement, then a Sunday gathering isn't simply a religious service. It's also one of the moments when the entire community comes together. You see people. You see families. You hear what's happening. You maintain relationships. And in an isolated place, relationships are infrastructure. You may not be able to rely on the next town, so you rely on the person next door. Here's another thing that might surprise you. Nukunonu isn't simply a place where adults live and work. Children grow up here. They go to school here. They have friends here. They play here. And eventually, some will leave. Others may stay. And that creates one of the biggest questions facing small Pacific communities. What happens when young people want more opportunities? Because Nukunonu can offer something that a giant city can't. Community, a slower rhythm, a very strong connection to family and tradition. But a larger city can offer universities, specialized jobs, different careers, and experiences that simply don't exist on a tiny atoll. So the future of a place like Nukunonu isn't just about whether the island physically survives. It's also about whether enough people choose to keep living there. This is where the picture of tropical paradise starts to change. When you look at Nukunonu from the air, it can look perfect. Turquoise lagoon, white sand, palm trees, tiny houses, endless Pacific. But the same geography that makes the place beautiful also makes it vulnerable. Tokelau's highest points are only around 3 to 5 meters above sea level. That's not a lot. And the land itself is narrow. In some places, you can almost feel how little separates the lagoon from the ocean. So rising seas aren't some abstract environmental issue happening somewhere far away. On a low coral atoll, the geography itself becomes the issue. The ocean isn't just your highway. It's also your boundary, and potentially, your greatest threat. Imagine living somewhere where the highest ground is only a few meters above sea level. Now imagine a storm. The same ocean that provides fish, brings supplies, connects you to the outside world, can suddenly become dangerous. And there is another problem: fresh water. On tiny coral atolls, there are no enormous rivers flowing down from mountains. There are no huge lakes. There is very little land. Everything has to be managed carefully, which means that living on Nukunonu requires an awareness of resources that most people in large cities never have to think about. Turn on the tap, and you probably don't think, where exactly did this water come from? On a remote atoll, that question matters. But here's where Nukunonu becomes even more interesting. Because the island isn't frozen in the past. Technology is changing the way people live here. Tokelau has invested in renewable energy because importing fuel across enormous distances is expensive and vulnerable to disruption. New Zealand Geographic has documented the island's move toward solar power. Think about what that means. A place that seems almost completely disconnected from the modern world is actually experimenting with ways to become more independent from it. Instead of constantly importing fuel, solar energy can use something the island has plenty of: sunlight. And that is one of the great contradictions of Nukunu. It looks isolated, but it is adapting to modern problems in ways that could become increasingly important for other small islands too. And there's another invisible connection: the internet. Because being physically isolated doesn't necessarily mean being socially isolated anymore. Someone in Nukunonu can communicate with people thousands of kilometers away, see the same news, watch the same videos, use the same social networks, and talk to family members living elsewhere. That creates a fascinating collision. You can live on one of the world's most geographically isolated atolls, while carrying a device that connects you instantly to almost the entire planet. The physical world says, "You're incredibly far away." The digital world says, "You're one click away." And that changes what isolation even means. But there's still one thing the internet can't fix. The internet can connect people. It can't create an airport. It can't make the ocean disappear. And it can't instantly bring a doctor, a mechanic, a replacement machine, or a shipment of supplies. Physical distance is still physical distance. If a crucial piece of equipment breaks, someone has to fix it. If supplies run late, people have to wait. If the sea becomes dangerous, boats can't simply arrive because somebody ordered something online. That is the part of remote life that photographs don't show. The inconvenience, the waiting, the planning, the dependence on weather, and the knowledge that some problems simply take longer to solve. And now we arrive at the question that matters most. If life is so complicated, Why stay? Asterisk asterisk. Why not move to Samoa, New Zealand, Australia, somewhere with airports, hospitals, universities, shopping centers, and endless options? Because from the perspective of someone who lives here, the equation isn't simply about convenience. Nukunonu offers something else: family, community, tradition, identity, the ocean, a way of life that has been passed between generations, and the ability to wake up every morning knowing almost exactly where you belong. The outside world may look at Nukunonu and see isolation, but the people who live there may see something completely different. They see home, but not everyone stays. Tokelau has a much larger population of Tokelauans living outside the territory, particularly in New Zealand and other Pacific communities. And that creates a fascinating relationship between Nukunu and the rest of the world. Someone can be born on this tiny atoll, grow up surrounded by ocean, leave for education, build a career somewhere else, and still remain deeply connected to home. So perhaps the most interesting thing about Nukunonu isn't that everyone stays. It's that home can remain home even after you've left it. And think about where we started. An island with no airport, a journey that can take more than a day by sea, around 30 tiny islets, a massive lagoon, a few hundred people, fishing traditions, churches, schools, solar power, boats carrying supplies, children growing up surrounded by ocean, and a community trying to balance a traditional way of life with a rapidly changing world. It's easy to look at a place like Nukunonu and call it isolated, but that word doesn't quite capture it. Because Nukunonu isn't empty, it isn't frozen in time, and it isn't disconnected. It's simply operating on a different scale. And perhaps the strangest thing about Nukunu isn't that it has no airport, it's that it doesn't necessarily need one. For generations, the ocean has been the connection. Boats are the roads. The lagoon is part of the community. Fishing is part of the economy and culture. The village is small enough for relationships to matter. And the distance that looks enormous on a map doesn't necessarily feel the same to someone who grew up here. Nukunonu can look like the edge of the world. To the people who call it home, it's simply home. There are places in the world that are famous because millions of people visit them. And then there are places like Nukunonu, where the opposite is true. Almost nobody comes. Almost nobody talks about it. And most people would struggle to point to it on a map. Yet people have built lives here. They've raised families here. They've created traditions here. They've adapted to the ocean, to distance, to limited land, and to a world that is changing around them. And perhaps that's what makes places like this so fascinating. Not because they're impossible to reach, but because they remind us that home doesn't have to look like ours. For most of us, a home is connected to a road. An airport is nearby. A supermarket is a short drive away. Help is usually only a phone call away. On Nukunu, the ocean comes first, and everything else has to work around it. So the next time you look at a map and see a tiny dot in the middle of the Pacific, don't assume there's nothing there. Sometimes, there's an entire world. You just have to travel a little farther to find it. This is Nukunonu, and this is how people live on an island with no airport.